This is The Hard Question on WCGO. Here's BQ.
Well, I'm sure that if you, my wonderful listeners, were the mayor of New York, you would know what happened this past weekend when the lights went out in New York City, 72,000 customers right there in Broadway, right around Hell's Kitchen. I mean, the lights went out. They lost their power. And the question is, what happened? And of course, you have them saying things like, well, over the next several days and weeks, our engineers and planners, they're going to know what exactly happened. Well, I've heard so many squirrely things of why they lost power and whether it was dirty tricks, sabotage, terrorism, and even climate change. People are blaming it on climate change. So, of course, I had to get an expert on the science of climate change and to maybe give us a little insight in what is going on and really the vulnerability of the grid around the entire United States. And joining us is Gregory Wrightstone, who's the author of a newly published book called Inconvenient Facts. It's a book that is shall we say, the complete opposite of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truths. Gregory, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on, BQ. Yeah, that's if we adopt a Green New Deal, your listeners and the rest of the people across the United States better accept things like that happening more often because we don't know what the cause was at this point. Like you say, we've got some things that are pointing towards transformers and everything, but if the Green New Deal goes forward, we're going to expect things like they see in Western Australia that's been plagued with brownouts and blackouts, and that's just because they're relying on wind and solar to do the job to supply electric, and you can't do it. We need fossil fuels, nuclear, yes, coal, natural gas-fired electric, the whole gamut. You can't do it with wind and solar.
There was, I would say that a president of the Sierra Club a few years back, who I interviewed, and he was chastised and eventually left the Sierra Club because he talked about, green energy, and he talked about, whether it was solar or wind or whatever. He said, but you can't get there without using fossil fuels. Well, he was looked at as a villain for telling what I think is the truth. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, I don't believe we've talked before. I think it's our first time, and your listeners will be surprised to know that I'm a huge proponent of carbon dioxide. If you look on the back of my SUV, I've got a bumper sticker that says, I heart CO2, because I truly believe in the research and the science supports the matter that rising temperatures and increasing CO2 are benefiting both the Earth and humanity, and it ain't even close. We're seeing an Earth that's thriving and prospering and greening. Vegetation's exploding. Humanity's benefiting. Just about everything we look at in the human experience is rising and prospering. So what this is these so-called solutions of scaling back, getting off of fossil fuels. This is what I call a solution in search of a problem, because they're saying that increasing CO2 is going to lead to catastrophic high temperatures. Yet, if we look over the last several thousand years of human history, the last several warming periods, the Minoan, the Roman, the medieval warm periods, all were higher temperatures than what we had today, and all were associated with periods of great prosperity and bountiful harvests and an explosion of technology and art. There's a tremendous correlation between rising temperatures, the rise and fall of temperatures, and the rise and fall of civilizations. They've got it just backwards.
So we're in a period now, about 300 years into this warming period, and I don't know if you're familiar with a scientist by the name of Leighton Stewart. And Leighton Stewart,
no, I don't.
Well, you would, be like-minded spirits. And he wrote a book called CO2 is Good for You. He also worked with a group of NASA scientists who about, I want to say 2, 3, 4 years ago came out, over 100 of them, and said that said CO2 was good for the planet. We were able to see it get published in the New York Times, but all of a sudden that has gone quiet. Why do they want to make the idea, why do they want to kind of spread the rumor or their perception, guys like Al Gore, that CO2 is bad for the planet? What good does that do for them, and what good does it do for the planet?
It's a useful model for them to do. What are their intentions is the question you're asking, and that's we're getting away from the realm of science into political science, but I opened my book up with a quote from H.L. Mencken. In that, I'll just paraphrase quickly, but he talks about the need for governments to create imaginary hobgoblins of alarm with which to frighten the population. And you need a frightened population to gladly accept things like the Green New Deal or the Paris Climate. Why in the world would we as a nation, anyone, accept economically crippling sanctions that will make everything more expensive, energy more expensive, all products more expensive, and restrict our freedoms? Why would we do it? The only answer is that we're on the edge of this climate precipice, ready to plunge into one climate apocalypse event after another. And I just don't see it. If we look at the things they're saying that's going to go bad, well, they're based on failed climate models that overpredict warming. And I look at those same things, and if you look what's actually happening today, you'll find a lot of these things they're talking about that are horrible: famine, forest fires, droughts, heat waves are all in decline. It's opposite of what we're being told, completely opposite. And I show and categorize that in my book.
You talk about even the polar ice caps, even if you have said that even if they melt, it would not cause damage to or the rise in the water level. How is it that they're getting the science so completely wrong?
Well, because they're using this. They're using this to demonize, take anything to use it to advance their agenda. And AOC's chief of staff let the cat out of the bag last week, and he stated to the Washington Post in an interview that by this I mean the Green New Deal, isn't about environment or climate change. It's about changing the American and world economic systems. They want it. She's a socialist, and so is he, and that's what they want. This is all. They need to tear down the system and tear down the American economy. And he actually stated that that's what this is all about. He said it has nothing to do with environment or climate change. And I'm if he says it, I'll believe him. Yeah.
Well, you have to believe you have to believe when people say things to you. And he is directing a lot of her political positions. The questions that I have again around that are the fact of, when they talk to people, if you question them, the line they've been using for the last 6 years, I know this firsthand, and they will look down on you and they will say, well, the science is settled. That term has been used so much, to which I always question, if you're truly a scientist, science is never settled.
Yeah, that's right. And I've heard from a lot of people, they think it's the best takedown of that 97% argument. That's on my website, inconvenientfacts.xyz. So I've got a page devoted to it and one of my blogs that are there explaining in detail how wrong this 97% consensus is, and pointing out that the fellow that wrote the study that supposedly backstops it, his own data shows that it's less than 0.5% actually believe that. And by that I mean his 97% would include me as part of that 97%, because I believe that CO2 is increasing and it has some warming effect. And because I believe that, he would say I'm part of that 97%. I just think the warming effect from CO2 is fairly modest and just greatly overwhelmed by the same natural forces that have been driving temperatures since the dawn of time. Those natural forces, BQ, they didn't stop in the middle of the 20th century. They're in place and operating today just as they have for millions of years.
Clearly, I would say people have to be careful with the environment. And I'm sure there are certain things that are devastating to the environment that almost anyone would agree with. But the question is, we look at countries like the United States and this Paris climate change, other countries like China, Mexico, and other places that are not doing anything to try to improve the environment at all, yet the United States is looked as the big bad guy. Why is that?
Yeah, if you go to the EPA website, or if you just Google EPA and pollution, the thing that'll pop up first is there is a big chart PDF of, you can trace all the pollutants, not nitrogen oxide, sulfur oxide, particulates, all of them are declining. It's the cleanest it's been since they started keeping records, and keeps getting cleaner every year, and that's going to continue. We should be proud of what we've done in the United States with our record. What I like to look at is, if we look in the rearview mirror, look back in history over the last 100 years, all we see is human advancement. We see increasing life expectancy, increasing food production. Health keeps increasing. Now, just about every category is increasing and increasing and increasing. They look in the future and see nothing but doom, demise, and despair. I don't buy it again.
Well, the term is that I've heard from people like AOC, I believe even Prince Charles, they use the term 12 years. It's like they're giving you, beware, the end of the world will come in 12 years. Where is this arbitrary 12 years coming from?
Yeah, well, it's a moving target. In 12 years, it'll be another 12 years. That was just, and the UN had a 2005 report where they predicted there would be 50 million climate refugees by 2010. Well, when 2010 rolled around, the islands they listed as most at risk actually had gained population. People were moving to those islands instead of fleeing them. And then in 2015, the UN made the same prediction. 50 million in 2015, they said by 2020, there'll be 50 million climate refugees. Well, we haven't seen any yet, and we're not going to. The Earth is the tiny amount of sea level rise we're seeing, which started around 1850, the mid-1800s, long before we had any influence at all on the temperature of CO2.
Now hold that thought. We're talking with Gregory Wrightstone, who is the author of a book called Inconvenient Facts about the whole issue of climate change. I'm Blanquita Cullum. This is The Hard Question on WCGO AM and FM in Chicago. And you can hear us on the SoundCloud thanks to John Lester Insurance, lesterinsure1.com. We'll be back.
This is The Hard Question on WCGO. Here's BQ.
How do you really get actual history on how many earthquakes we've had, how many hurricanes we've had, how many tornadoes, how many natural major disasters we've had? People look at the Grand Canyon, they look at things that are happening right now, quakes that have been happening recently. Again, in San Francisco, they keep talking about the San Andreas Fault. In fact, there used to be an old poster that used to say, "Don't blame LA, it's San Andreas Fault." But the question is, how do we know? Because really, I worked for a brief period at the Federal Emergency Management Agency about 20 years ago, and it hasn't been that long that we've been actually keeping a documented record of how many disasters there have been. Well, joining me is the author of a newly published book called Inconvenient Facts, the science that Al Gore doesn't want you to know. And I'm talking about our guest, Gregory Wrightstone. And part of the problem is we really don't have any good records of, what happened in an ice age afterwards, or how long do these periods last? Maybe you can enlighten us on that, Gregory.
Well, actually, the ice data we have is actually pretty accurate, because it captures we have ice core data going back 800,000 years, and it's pretty well, the dates are pretty firmly established, because each year leaves another thin layer of ice that accumulates. And so we can, particularly volcanoes, we can tell when volcanoes erupt. It's fascinating. There are sulfates, they're called, that erupt with it, and when those erupt, we can capture that in the ice data. Actually, BQ, I'm researching right now a really interesting aspect relating volcanism to global warming, and there's a great correlation. What it does is it thins the ozone layer. It sends out bromine and chlorine from these huge volcanic eruptions that thin the ozone layer, which allow more UV rays, which warm the Earth. And it's fascinating. It's not very well accepted, but that's just another theory that, boy, you look at the numbers, there's a great correlation there. And so it's fascinating things like that. We've just barely scratched the surface of some of this information. But we go back, we can document a lot of this information, not earthquakes, but volcanoes pretty well. But the temperature record, what you're talking about, the temperature record, the satellite data only goes back to 1979. The temperature data really goes back to 1850.
And we don't know if there were other, like in 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, if there were hurricanes that were comparable to Katrina. We don't know about that data because obviously we didn't have the data here because no one was here. So we don't know. And maybe there's some cave somewhere, somebody wrote some picture on painted a picture about some disaster, but we don't know.
Yeah, well, actually, there was a study by the University of Mexico City. I've captured that in my book, that actually they documented Gulf of Mexico hurricanes going back to the year 1750, believe it or not.
Wow.
And they show a decline. That's in the book. They show a decline and state flat out that there's been a several hundred-year decline in hurricanes, which is fascinating. But again, it's really this modern era since the satellites went up when we can capture every single darn hurricane that goes up. One of the big things BQ, that we haven't talked about is, and I think it's a missing part of this whole story of climate change, is even if what I did was I looked at what's called the MAGIC simulator, MAGICC. It documents how much temperature rise would be averted if we got rid of various amounts of carbon dioxide. And I just took a look at Illinois. If Illinois reduced 100%, the entire state reduced 100% of its CO2 emissions, are you sitting down? Because here's how much temperature rise would, okay, good. I don't want you to be falling over. This is how much temperature rise would be averted. 0.003 of a degree Fahrenheit by the year 2050 and 0.007 of a degree Fahrenheit by the year 2100. How many jobs lost is a temperature differential measured in thousandths of a degree Fahrenheit worth? I'd say 0, but that's what they want to do.
And illness increasing and, early death from people, suffering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, we're not hailing the successes, and we're trying to repeal the successes. Let me talk to you about the sun, because, here on radio, we always worry about when we have sun flashes, sunspots, and some people are saying that the sun is cooling. Is the sun cooling? Is it, is it just kind of done its due and, another million years it's over? What do we expect to happen with the sun?
I can't talk long term, but we can do. We've got a really, really good record of sunspot activity. And it's very cyclical, and we're going into what right now is what's called a grand solar minimum. I've read a lot of material on this from scientists that I respect greatly. They're predicting a 30-year decline in temperatures, and again, historically, what we've seen throughout human civilization is that the warming periods were hugely beneficial to civilization. It was the cold that was terrible. Each cold period was associated with crop failure, famine, pestilence, and mass depopulation. That's what you get.
Wow.
Excuse me. That's what you get with cooling periods, and that's cold is bad. If you're a fan of Game of Thrones, if winter is coming, it's going to be bad, bad, bad. Because Jon Snow's seen it's going to be bad for Earth, humanity. No matter where you are, the cold periods will be bad.
And how do you know when the cold periods are coming? How do you know when that people have talked about the shift in the magnetic field that we're expecting some kind of a polar shift. Is that going to happen?
Yeah, it will, but not. I don't expect it for quite a while. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about. I'm a geologist. I'm a student of history and geologic past. And I like to look at the past warming periods that we've had and expect that this warming trend that we've been in now for 300 years, if it's anything like the last several, we can expect some more warming. It might warm up another degree or 2 degrees over the next, I expect, but this is just basing it on what's happened before. I fully expect it to increase and warm for the next 50 or maybe 100 years, but it might end tomorrow. These people that well-respected scientists with this grand solar minimum, they could certainly be right. The problem is anybody that tells you for sure what's going to happen, they're not worth their weight. Because I don't know what's going to happen 50 years from now, and neither do they. But they're using their predictions with 100% certainty to cause economic disruption for all of us.
Well, it's arrogance, too. And it's an arrogance of trying to be the king over the climate. And that means money, grants, power, and control politically, as you know, and who can do what? I'm not a president of this country, but I'm a climate king, so I can influence what your country does. I can shame you. I can make it more of a universal mindset because I have scared the world by saying the end is coming. We better change it now. Am I right or wrong?
You're right. You're right. And it's part of people keeping enslaved and keeping them down. What they're proposing is going to destined billions of people around the world to more generational poverty. And we should be using, I'm a contributing writer for the Cornwall Alliance, a Christian group, and we believe that we should use all of our resources, or what they would say all of God's creation, for the betterment of mankind and do it as good stewards. So we should use everything to lift people up out of poverty, up out of hunger. Use all of our resources, and that includes fossil fuels. But do it as good stewards. Do it correctly.
We haven't even talked about the whole question of shale. And, you know, right now with what's been happening in Saudi Arabia and Iran and so forth, I guess we have a very strong position here with being energy efficient. And certainly with oil, a lot of people don't like using shale oil, but the question is, do we allow young men and women to go die in a war for oil? I mean, by countries that are determining the price of oil. Thoughts?
Oh, well, you've actually got a shale expert on your hands here. I was the co-author of the first comprehensive peer-reviewed paper on the Marcellus Shale, which is the largest natural gas field in the world by far. I mean, it dwarfs the size of the field. The next 19 gas fields in the world combined equal what the Marcellus is right here. That's how big it is. It's incredible. And it's this huge resource that I would like to use natural gas and think it should really be used to switch over much of our transportation to natural gas-fired compressed gas vehicles. And that way we could wean ourselves off of a lot of our needs for oil by these vast, our resources of natural gas. While oil production and oil reserves are huge, we're awash in natural gas reserves that'll last hundreds of years. I'm a big proponent of natural gas-fired vehicles.
I hope you're going to come back and visit us again. You've been just delightful to have on this show. Gregory Wrightstone. Don't forget to get his book, and it's called Inconvenient Facts, the Science That Al Gore Doesn't Want You to Know. And, of course, you can get that on Amazon and bookstores all over. I'm Blanquita Cullum, BQ. This is The Hard Question on WCGO Radio and WCGORadio.com.